Good morning to those in Washington, D.C., and evening to those in Syria. I'm Aaron Zelin, the Gloria and Ken Levy Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Today, we have a two-part policy forum exploring the aftermath of the multi-actor violence that occurred in Suwayda in the past 2 weeks, which included non-state Bedouin/tribal forces, Druze militia, the Syrian government forces, as well as Israel's Air Force. In this first part, I'll be moderating a discussion with Qutaiba Idlbi, who is the Director of American Affairs at the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East program, where he led the council's work on Syria. After about 25 minutes, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Noam Raydan, who will introduce the second part of this policy forum. But for now, I will first hand over the floor to Qutaiba for a brief 3 to 5 minute remark, who he just recently, earlier today, just came back from Suwayda himself. And then I'll conduct a Q&A with him exploring these sensitive issues and how Syria seeks to deal with it going forward. So thank you again for joining us today, Qutaiba.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you, Aaron, and thanks for WINEP for having me. Glad to be here and hope to be with you in person quite soon. Just to get directly into this, of course, I think many probably around in Washington and those who are listening are familiar, with the background of what happened in the last few weeks. But it might be worth it just to run quickly through, the events that happened. Of course, over the last 8 months, there have been several discussions happening across different parts of the country over the integration of those different parts of Syria that have seen I would say different part of an autonomous status over the 14 years of war. And that was part of the reconciliation slash reintegration process that all was hoping it would get us to one place. Of course, Suwayda was unique in its model as a province. It's different than the coast. It's different than Northeast Syria. And that is because of certainly one, of course, the sectarian nature in the province, in the sense of having not only tribal Sunni communities, but also, of course, the Druze community in the majority of the province, but also unique in terms of the diversity within the community itself. You have a lot of independent, a strong civil society and activist community within the province, especially in the city. You have the religious class within the city, kind of divided under three religious leaders in the province. But also then there was the community of former regime officials, whether from Suwayda or from outside of Suwayda, who sought refuge in the mountains there basically right after the liberation, which kind of created the main unit or the main nucleus that was the source of a lot of the instability and the skirmishes that we've seen in the last 8 months, leading to the unfortunate events 2 weeks ago. Of course, as this continuous tension between, the Bedouin and the Druze is not new. It is probably as old as the provinces, or as old as the communities there are. What was new in the last, in those skirmishes, the inability of the state or of the government, in a sense, to intervene meaningfully to stop the small incidents that were causing this tension, especially because from day one, there was a lot of debate and there was no permission from local community, from some leaders in the province, for the state security to come into the province. So in a sense, what we've seen is when basically the government sent forces to, in a sense, break the fight, especially along the Damascus-Suwayda highway north of the province. Basically, first there were attacks on the government forces, leading to the killing of 15 and the kidnapping of over 30 of the Ministry of Interior forces. But then basically following that, there was an agreement among all leaders of Suwayda for the Ministry of Interior to come into the province to assert control, to get those kidnapped security personnel out, but also to kind of like change the status in a sense of lawlessness that the large swath of the province was going through. Whether it is the former IRGC affiliates who are still working on the Captagon trade, whether it is the former regime officials who are still seeking, hiding in the province, running the so-called military council, or in a sense, I wouldn't call it probably like a state of lawlessness, but also integrate the more independent protection forces that existed in large parts of the province, and they kind of like did a great job in the areas where they were successful to manage. Following that, and this is, I think, important to highlight, we've seen the Israeli intervention after that agreement, after security forces were able to enter the city through those agreements with those leaders in a matter of a couple of hours. We've seen this Israeli intervention that specifically targeted security forces, causing large casualties, but also at the same time forcing, in a sense, a complete withdrawal from the province, which left, in a sense, both communities exposed to each other, but also left a lot of space for lawless groups and militias, basically, to go after or to do the actions that probably they wanted to do, or like to flame more sectarian tensions than the province already had. Leading to the unfortunate events that we've seen. We're still, in the aftermath of those few days of the fights. The government has, with international partners, was able to reach a ceasefire agreement between both parties, between largely different groups of Bedouin, tribal, and other forces in the province, and other forces basically on the other side, whether affiliated with Al-Hajri, the military council, or others. And since then, our main focus has been, on one hand, on cementing the ceasefire itself, but on the other hand, especially in the last 10 days, our main focus has been on really trying to diffuse the issues that would cause the fighting to continue. And that was mainly the release of hostages and the exchange of prisoners. Of course, over the last 10 days, it took basically 10 days just to work on releasing around 1,500 Bedouin families, mostly women, children, and elderly, who were held in Al-Kafar and Shahba. And we're working actively to move forward with the exchange of any remaining fighters or POWs, basically, that are held by the different groups within Suwayda and its countryside. And hoping, basically, as we've seen in the last few days, as the security situation calmed down, as the ceasefire is cemented, we're seeing more capability now to send more aid convoys, to allow government teams to continue their work. Of course, inside the city, in some areas of the province, the same government employees and directories continue to actually do their work, even without officially saying that they are government employees, or without raising the flag, for example. But those services continue despite being attacked every now and then, despite infrastructure in the province, whether electricity or cell phone towers being attacked by different groups inside and outside the province. I think we've been able to do a lot of work to really try to reestablish some of the normalcy, and hoping that in the next few days, as things now have calmed a little bit, as the exchange of prisoners or fighters would happen, we're hoping that would cause the environment to really calm down, and it would be helpful for us to restart the political process with different elements of the province, but also start a communal process that could bring back together those communities within Suwayda. Myself, just to end on that, and my apologies for taking a lot of time, I'm quite hopeful that we will be able to do this. Syria has been through probably a lot worse in the last 14 years in its history. And still Syrians have decided to live next to each other, to decide to move forward and not to look back, while of course providing accountability for crimes committed. So I'm hopeful of I'm very trustful of the Syrian people's ability to be able to move forward and basically help us put this effort together, because without this first communal and collective discipline, without the willingness of different Syrian communities, it would be really hard to move forward. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Qutaiba, for your remarks. Just sort of building off of what you were saying, and beyond sort of the specifics of the violence, as well as some of the reforms I think many people hope for in the security sector. This country is dealing with multiple traumas: the trauma of 54 years of totalitarian rule, 14 years of civil war, especially amongst the majority Sunni population, as well as various minorities and their own historical traumas, as well as the recent violence on the coast and now in Suwayda as well. How can the new Syrian state not only balance the understandable, legitimate position of many Sunnis that want people to acknowledge everything that they've been through themselves and justice needed related to this suffering, but also at the same time recognizing that others in society are scared about their own futures? What can the new state do to better assuage these fears and make Syria whole in many respects?
It's not an easy task to start with. And as I just ended, I think so far in the last 8 months, I think this experiment has been successful because not only because of the efforts of the government. I think this is a small factor, but mainly because of the willingness of the Syrian people to have this collective discipline, to have this collective willingness to support this process and move forward. I think the problem with collective discipline, if you see if a small group of individuals or if a small group basically violates this collective discipline, the whole agreement collapses, because it's just based on trust, because it's based on this self-collective agreement among everyone. What we're hoping for, or what it would require, definitely, I think there's a lot of efforts required from the government side. As I mentioned, the government is very much focusing right now on the process itself to diffuse any causes or reasons to restart the fight in the province between Bedouin, tribal, or other communities in Suwayda and the Druze community in Suwayda. But also we're starting to look kind of like more medium term and long term in terms of how can we start a reconciliation process that can help us at least gain back some of the track we were on in terms of figuring out what agreement could be in place where, yes, communities feel that they are safe enough, feel that they do belong, feel that the government and the state is there to protect them, while also at the same time sending the message, as you mentioned, to large communities around Syria that we need this agreement together, that basically while working on accountability, while working on pushing the country forward, we need a lot of talks, we need a lot of conversations among each other, and which does not mean that previous grievances are being forgotten. So it's a tricky balance, to be honest. If you look at it from the outside, it seems like an impossible thing to achieve in Syria right now. But I guess not only myself, I think many people in the government today, we are a bunch of dreamers who do believe in this country, who do believe in our people, and who believe basically that all together we can do the impossible. In this case, trying to get over what happened, hold perpetrators accountable without opening new grievances, and just move forward in the best way that Syria and its people deserve.
So, of course, in the aftermath of the coastal violence that happened in March, we saw that President Ahmed Ashara created a fact-finding mission, which just shared the results last week, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in the aftermath of this recent violence in Suwayda, the Ministry of Defense announced sort of that it'll conduct some internal investigations of its own forces. Do you foresee that the state will also have another fact-finding mission related to this as well, or will the MOD more or less deal with its internal ranks now instead?
No, there will definitely be a process to hold perpetrators accountable for the violence that happened in the last couple of weeks. Of course, the focus has been so far, because we've received this question, why haven't a committee or a special prosecutor has been announced? Because the main focus has been on just actually stopping the fight. I think it has been probably only 2 or 3 days where we haven't seen violations for the ceasefire agreement that was reached 2 weeks ago. And I'm glad, or sorry, a week ago, and I'm glad we are getting there. But as soon as the situation settled, the Ministry of Defense investigation would only cover basically any violations from government forces, whether in the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Interior. But there will be an investigation on all violations and crimes that were committed. And this is the majority of the violations that were committed by other parties, basically from all sides. We're hoping to get something out on that quite soon. But yeah, this will be under the Ministry of Justice, basically will oversee a process of investigating and bringing all perpetrators to justice.
So returning to the original fact-finding committee, as I noted, it released its report to the president last week and also held a press conference about it. What do you see as the biggest lessons learned from it, and how can the government sort of internalize these in terms of force cohesion and discipline and implement reforms so that what happened in March, as well as more recently in Suwayda, hopefully doesn't happen again in these places or elsewhere in the country again?
Certainly. I mean, I think there are two main issues probably to learn from, as the report shows, and as also other international efforts to investigate what happened will show in the near future. I think on the number one, definitely there are lessons learned in terms of strengthening command and control structure within armed forces under the Syrian government. And as we see in what's going to come out, especially from the Ministry of Justice, again, there will be a process where perpetrators of the violence there will be held accountable. I think so. There are lessons learned there. I think the question from the government side is how could that fit today, considering where the state is today? As you know, this is Syria in its age right now. It's kind of like a newborn country, and we have like a newborn state. So there is a question of resources. There is a question of institutional memory. There's a question of setting up processes and how countries can actually, our international partners can meaningfully support such processes. So, for example, I know from day one, there are a lot of conversations with international partners to support rebuilding the Syrian army, to support rebuilding the institutions of the military. But for example, because of existing sanction programs, because of existing UN designations, any support for Syria's military or security sector is actually punished. So it's really hard even for international partners who are willing to support such a process to engage meaningfully in this process. I think the other problem or the other lesson learned is how do we deal with an effective DDR process in a sense, which I think is the problem that the report from the commission highlighted. And I think it is definitely the problem that we've seen during the violence in Suwayda. I think the report from the commission from the events on the coast highlighted how there were around 200,000 fighters who were self-mobilized from different parts of the country. So there is a question here, how can the country really expedite this DDR process that doesn't necessarily focus on groups? And the main issue, but rather actually focuses on the individuals themselves. In a sense, the 14 years of war has really created, in a sense, a freedom fighter in every household in Syria. So in a sense, how can we create a process where Syrians themselves feel that they've reached the end goal, they've got their state back, but then we start basically this integration process. And it's really hard, to be honest, to do that without, again, the process of complete lifting of sanctions on Syria. We've seen a lot of political statements, support from the international community, in terms of the political line on Syria, but that hasn't yet translated in meaningful support that whether it is the government or the Syrian people can depend on. Again, just in the simplest of ways, just to create job opportunities for people to actually feel that they can move forward and build their lives back. So I think working on both, learning from those two lessons, I think those are the most important tracks to work on in the future. It requires definitely a lot of work on the government side, but it definitely requires also a lot of support and partnerships from the international community.
Great. Thanks for that answer. According to the fact-finding committee, the names presented to the judiciary will not be made public, and they will take care of it themselves. But we've seen since then that the Ministry of Interior has arrested a number of, former regime figures that were involved in starting the violence that unfortunately then led to the massacre. I know that some people worry that this might create an issue of lacking transparency and thus undermining sort of the future of this process. Can you maybe speak to some of these worries that some might have related to that?
Certainly. So the committee itself is not tasked with announcing basically the names of perpetrators. So this would be, again, the task again of the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Justice. Yes, the Ministry of Interior, more recently, they did make public arrests of individuals who were involved in basically instigating or starting this violence back in the coast. But let's also remember that there were previous arrests for fighters or affiliates of the government forces and of other fighters right actually after the events on the coast. So the process, there are two tracks in a sense, for sure. Perhaps maybe the timing was not helpful in a sense to really send that message. But if we look at the spectrums, at the timeline since the events, since the announcement of the committee, you will see that there was an equal and just process from the Ministry of Interior in terms of those announcements. But definitely, I think, especially that the committee just finished its work, that we are at the beginning of this process. So hopefully, as soon as there is more on the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Justice side, there will be more announcement, just to make sure, as you said, that justice is not blind and this is not a selective justice. On our side, we're making it very clear. The accountability and justice process needs to include all, and no one would really be able to shy away from getting the justice and accountability they deserve.
So, final question. What role do you see the US playing in assisting the new Syrian government and helping it thread sort of this sensitive needle related to the competing Syrian voices throughout the country seeking various forms of justice? Is there something the US could help you all do to make this a better situation?
Certainly. I mean, I think first, continuing to implement the policy line that President Trump has set in Riyadh back in May would be very important. I think the US government has greatly been working to implement the policy that President Trump outlined back in May. But we are still short from fully implementing that policy. whether it is the existing of the Caesar Act, whether it is the state sponsor of terrorism designation on Syria, whether it is the designations on the UN Security Council level. All of those are still hindering the ability of international partners, including the US, to provide the necessary technical and other kind of support to the Syrian government, to the Syrian people, to be able to start walking this path to move forward. So that is on one side. I think on the other side, there's definitely a bigger role for the US in helping Syria limit foreign interventions into Syrian matters, whether that is coming from Iranian militias who are still trying to reestablish their presence in Syria, whether that is from ISIS through the work with the global coalition to defeat ISIS, whether that is from Hezbollah, who are still constituting a threat against Syria's national security across Lebanese borders, and whether that is from Israeli interventions coming from the south that are only making matters worse in southern Syria. Let's not forget that all of this violence that we've seen only erupted basically right after Israeli intervention in the south, in Suwayda, in Damascus. And it did create this environment where it put communities in Syria on the opposite side of each other. As I said at the beginning, Syrians are able to resolve their own problems peacefully. I think all of us as Syrians are tired of 14 years of war, and we do believe that 14 years of war are enough for us. And I think there is a collective willingness among the majority of Syrians, when there is no foreign intervention, to come to the table and resolve things peacefully and politically rather than to revert to using arms. So I think this is where the US could really play a very constructive role in helping Syria make sure that it is secured so it doesn't threaten any of its neighbors, but also help make sure that Syria's neighbors do not constitute a security or social threat towards Syria.
Great. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today, Qutaiba. I know that you're extremely busy and appreciate you answering some tough questions. So good luck with everything. I'll now turn things over to my colleague Noam for part 2 of this policy forum. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you, Qutaiba. Before I move to the second session, I would like to say a few words. The deadly sectarian violence that broke out in the Druze-majority province of Suwayda earlier this month left hundreds killed, thousands displaced, amid reports of widespread violations and abuses, including summary executions, kidnappings, destruction of private property, and looting of homes. Some government forces that were supposed to stop the fighting between Druze and Bedouin fighters reportedly committed serious human rights violations, raising several questions about the new government's ability to safely handle the transition while protecting minorities and other communities across the country. As of July 25, poor security conditions were still restricting access to Suwayda, limiting the ability of the UN and partners to deliver aid to those affected by the violence, according to UN report. Similar violence and atrocities were also committed in March in the Alawite-dominated Syrian coastal region. Harrowing violations and abuses were also reported. Our second session asks several questions about what happened in Suwayda and the way forward. What steps can Damascus take to build trust between the Druze and other vulnerable communities after a string of mass atrocities, some reportedly at the hands of government forces? In Washington, how should US officials approach ongoing talks with Syria and Israel to prevent further violations while paving the way towards stability and inclusivity? And is there a plan B for Syria if the current authorities fail to act? To discuss these issues, I'm very pleased to be joined today by three experts who have been following the latest developments in Syria very closely. First, my colleague, Andrew Tabler, who is the Martin J. Gross Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Rubin Program on Arab Politics, where he focuses on Syria, the Levant, and U.S. Middle East policy. Andrew previously served as senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Syria engagement at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and director for Syria at the National Security Council's Middle East Affairs Directorate. His most recent piece on Syria, titled Making Sure Damascus Learns the Right Lessons from the Suwayda Clashes, was published last week, and those who are interested in reading it can visit right now the Washington Institute's homepage. Sawsan Abou Zainedin is a Syrian civil society professional, an architect and urban development planner by training. She works at the intersection of democratic transitions and urban recovery. She leads pioneering initiatives that center local agency, justice, and inclusive governance in Syria. Mazen Ezzi is a journalist and researcher specializing in social, economic, and conflict dynamics in Syria. He writes regularly about the developments in the Suwayda province, the local dynamics behind the emergence of the new local actors and armed groups, in addition to the changes that traditional religious clerics have been going through in Suwayda. He is also the editor of the Housing, Land, and Property section of the Syria Report website. Thank you everyone for joining me today. Before I move to our questions or discussion, some housekeeping, please. To our audience, everyone who's watching us, if you would like to ask questions for any of our panelists during the event, please make sure to enter them in the Q&A box, which is below at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Now we're done with housekeeping. Andrew, you ready for my first questions?
Sure.
All right. First, I would like to know what you thought of Mr. Qutaiba Idlbi's comments on the violence in Suwayda. And also, I would like to ask you to set the stage for all of us with respect to the sectarian bloodshed we saw in the Druze-dominated province. As you know, Andrew, and you've been following this very closely, what happened in Suwayda came after separate sectarian massacres we saw in the Alawite-dominated coastal region that included the involvement of government forces, according to several reports, including an investigation conducted by Reuters and published in June. My question, what do these alarming events against minorities tell us about the capability of the current authority in Damascus to safely handle the transition and achieve national unity? Bear with me, please. Secondly, and as you noted in your recent piece, which you have already with you printed for the Washington Institute, there have been many reports of foreign fighters' involvement in the killings, not only recently against the Druze, but also against Alawites in March. Can Damascus indeed get extremist foreign fighters out of the security forces and out of Syria eventually? And what role can Washington play on all these critical issues? A lot of questions to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noam. And it's a pleasure to be with you here today. So, a couple of thoughts. Qutaiba just came from Washington and worked with the Atlantic Council as well as different aspects of the Syrian opposition for years. And I think did a pretty good job of addressing and saying the right things in terms of the response to the events. We talked about reconciliation and reintegration process, talked about diversity, used the word about accountability. And I think he is among those, and I know some others he called them bunch of dreamers. And I think what he meant was by that he's trying to help move the country in a new direction. He also talked about holding perpetrators accountable, and as well as some of the outlines of the MOD internal investigation. And he also said that there would be, of course, another investigation, which has yet to be announced, but perhaps is in the works. And I think it was important for him to talk about how there was a real problem with command and control and how there needed to be more work, certainly on that. What we saw happen over the last 10 days or so does not demonstrate, I think, in sort of to your first question, that the government in Damascus has the capability to maintain control. I think their control is quite limited, and I think he actually kind of admitted to that.
Right.
Certainly, lack of discipline as well. He did also mention that the state had limited capabilities, and I think that also was demonstrated in that incident as well. And then, of course, he talked about a process about accountability and perhaps some kind of punishment going forward. I thought was really interesting, though, in the summary concerning the tilt towards talking about relief of sanctions.
Right.
I think that, of course, President Trump made a very strategic decision. I think he made a big bet on Ahmed Ashara and the transitional government. I've never seen sanctions lifted like this ever. Syrian sanctions were also the most comprehensive in the world by some, or multi-layered in the world. So taking them apart is difficult. But the executive order on the 30th of June, combined with efforts on Capitol Hill to repeal things like sanctions, on Caesar sanctions, I think are quite comprehensive. Unfortunately, I think that the government's response to what happened in Suwayda is going to complicate that latter effort, and that is it's going to raise, I think it already has raised, serious questions on Capitol Hill concerning the bipartisan effort to move to lift Caesar sanctions. In the end, I think that this gets down to the given that the bet was made by President Trump, and he has 5 points, which I talk about in my policy watch. I think he meant them. I think he meant that he wants Syria to sign on to the Abraham Accords. He wants them to deal with foreign terrorists. And that's sort of code for foreign fighters, right? That are in the ranks of the transitional government, concerning Palestinian groups, concerning battling against the Islamic State, and responsibility for the detention centers. I think he really means that. I think the problem is that the government has limited capabilities, and its ability to deliver on the different processes within Syria. And I think this is where it gets really, and I'm looking forward to the comments from our panelists today. Ultimately, in the end, as a policymaker in Washington, we can all only do so much and lay out so many carrots and potential sticks. We've front-loaded all the carrots with sanctions relief, and have many more potentially on the way. But unless there's a viable political process inside of Syria, then all of this is not going to work. And so far, we don't see that. So in my piece, I argued that there were two ways to start. One concerns point 2 of President Trump's list, which deals with foreign terrorists or foreign fighters to leave Syria. I think a good first step, as I argue, would be to get them out of the ranks of the both Ministry of Defense and the Interior Ministry's forces, and to keep them from fighting alongside of the government's forces. A major problem with command and control is that we have, in addition to Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior Forces, we have what are called, many people call hooligans, showing up, fighting in different areas. That certainly happened on the Syrian coast. Then, of course, here it's described as tribal members, some of which were tribal members. I mean, I think it's very difficult to have a Syrian political process where people put down their arms and integrate into one state while you have these mystery forces fighting alongside of them. And I think that is a major problem that the government has to deal with. And I think so I think that the government can deal with foreign fighters, and I think it has to. How it deals with them, it's up to them. But they have to be dealt with, whether they are out of the security services and then they stay in Syria for a while because a lot of them can't go home. Right. So be it. But they have to be addressed now. And I think also in terms of the overall discipline of the forces, I think that what the command and control needs to emphasize is also just extremism within their ranks. And I think that was demonstrated in the Suwayda incidents. They were demonstrated on the Syrian coast. They are outlined, as we understand, in the report on the Alawite, the incident with the Alawites, which is known as the coastal events, which happened last March. And I think that they need to be emphasized. You asked me what role Washington can play. I'll end with this. Washington, I think, can, and I think U.S. Envoy Barak is already doing this. They need to hold the Ahmadinejad's and the government's accountable to what happened, and to make sure that it doesn't happen again, because off in the distance, in the not too distant future, we have other integration processes within the country. If you can somehow compartmentalize what's happening in Suwayda, which is still ongoing, as Qutaiba talked about, we have the whole issue with integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria, and the unresolved issues, what's going on the coast. We need a political process. We need it now. We need to build trust in a central government, that they're simply not going to be dominated by the central government and forced to surrender. And I think what we saw in Suwayda is not a good sign that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
But hopefully I'm wrong. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Before quickly I move to Mazen. So Qutaiba Idlbi mentioned that when Aaron asked him, like, what can the U.S. do? He said that U.S. could help continue to implement President Trump's policy that was announced in Riyadh in May. But based on what you said, what first needs to be done is hold the authorities, relevant authorities, accountable for not only what happened in Suwayda, but also in during the coastal events. You agree with that?
Correct. So
yeah.
It's, I mean, look, President Trump made a big bet. There are lots of carrots that are laid out for this, right? But it has to be built on a viable political process.
Yeah.
Right. And the way to do that is to quickly deal with these issues before they get out of hand, even more than they already are.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
This is, given everything that's happened, people died on both sides. It's true. And we're about ready to hear about more from those who are active on the Druze side. And I think that's great. But overall, the trajectory of integration in Syria is not going in a good direction.
Yeah.
And in order for that bet to work, we need it to go in a better direction. And the only way is through a viable political process. I think in the end, it's going to come down to sharing power.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've seen the Ahmadinejad government express willingness to do that. They have included non-Sunnis and those that are outside of HTS in the interim government. That's true.
Yeah.
But that's different than sharing power. And I think this is where some of their ways of dealing with the community might work in some Sunni-dominated areas, but in more mixed areas, of which there are considerable areas, and then in more minority-dominated areas, as in Suwayda and the Northeast, it's a different kettle of fish.
Right. Andrew, thank you so much. You summed it up in a very clear way. I appreciate it. I'm going to move to Mazen. And also Mazen and Sawsan, thank you for your patience with us. Mazen, first I would like to offer my sincere condolences to you. I know you lost family members and friends in the recent bloodshed that took place in Suwayda. So I very much appreciate you making time to join our panel. First, let me know if you'd like to respond to any of Mr. Qutaiba Idlibi's comments. Secondly, and as a person who has been closely monitoring the events in Suwayda, could you share with us the current humanitarian and security situation in the province amid the ceasefire? Are there fears that fighting will resume? And what are the key issues we should closely monitor moving forward? To you, Mazen, and thank you.
Thank you, Noam, and thank you all for your kind words of condolence. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to present a more accurate picture of what's happening in Suwayda beyond the oversimplified narrative of the transitional administration. But first, I have few words to this in response to Mr. Idlbi's talk. I think that there is a continuous effort to demonize the Druze. Some facts, but let me just to establish some facts. In May 2015, a Bedouin force from the Naim tribe, affiliated with the Ministry of Interior, set up its checkpoint on the Damascus-Suwayda road as part of a campaign calling to annihilate the Druze, led and supported by the transitional administration. It coincided with military attacks on the Druze areas near Damascus and Suwayda. The checkpoint was used to punish Druze civilians and as a political tool against those people who are rejecting the one-color state. Second thing, about the former regime officers in Suwayda. The officers currently there are residents of the governorate who lived there before the regime's fall. Third, the transitional administration has disabled the judicial police and has not paid the salaries of 2,500 police officers for 4 months, nor has it armed them. And also for the drug trafficking, it is carried out basically by Bedouin gangs, and Suwayda is merely a transit area. And finally, there is no such thing as a military council. Returning to your question, Naum, first on the humanitarian situation. The situation in Suwayda is catastrophic by every measure. Between July 11th and 24, over 100,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homes in northern and western countryside under intense shelling, home invasions, and summary executions. Entire villages such as Dur, Nijran, Mazra'a, and Sawar al-Kbiri were emptied of their residents. Around 2,000 people were confirmed killed, the vast majority of them civilians, including many women and children. Even more alarming than the scale of violence is the deliberate targeting of life-sustaining infrastructure. Hospitals were attacked, most notably the National Hospital in Suwayda City, where patients were executed and medical staff detained. Water infrastructures were deliberately destroyed, most significantly the Thali wells, which supply over 70% of Suwayda City's drinking water at the height of the severe drought, triggering a full scale of water crisis. Agricultural fields were torched, grain soil looted, and critical miles destroyed, placing the region's food security at a grave risk. Power and transformers were blown up, cutting electricity to tens of thousands of homes and disabling water pumps. This is not combat between armed groups. It is a systematic assault on civilians' ability to survive. Second, on the security situation and the risk of renewed fighting. Suwayda's entire western and northern countryside remains under the control of regime forces and allied tribal militias. Those forces continue to burn, destroy, and loot, targeting anyone who approaches the areas with sniper fire. While ceasefire agreements brokered by American and regional actors clearly require these forces to withdraw from Suwayda's administrative boundaries, they have refused. By contrast, Druze factions have so far fully honored the ceasefire, even in the face of repeated violations. The refusal to withdraw appears to be part of broader political and military strategy to maintain pressure on the province, or to resume hostilities if negotiations between the Syrian regime and Israeli collapse. Those forces have also cut off all main roads into the governorate and report directly to Ahmed Dalati, head of the so-called Transitional Administration's Security Committee in Suwayda. In addition, they control the flow of humanitarian aid, blocking access to both UN agency and international journalists. Humanitarian delivery itself is being politicized. Aid is channeled exclusively through the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which lacks the capability to meet current needs. This creates a bottleneck, turning humanitarian assistance into a mechanism of coercion rather than a neutral tool for crisis response. Third, on the key issues to monitor going forward, several urgent priorities must be addressed. Sorry. Lifting the siege on Suwayda must be treated as an immediate humanitarian and political imperative. Opening an official border crossing with Jordan is essential to prevent starvation from being used as a weapon. Full implementation of the ceasefire, particularly the withdrawal of all non-local forces, must be monitored and enforced. Attempts to delay or circumvent this obligation must be firmly rejected. Also, U.S. agencies must be granted full access to assess needs and restoring village infrastructure, vital infrastructures, especially water wells and electrical networks. Emergency aid must be delivered without delay to support more than 100,000 displaced people, many of whom currently lack shelter, clean water, and food. A serious plan for reconstruction must be initiated to enable displaced residents to return. Without it, the ceasefire risks becoming merely a temporary pause in violence and forced displacement into maybe become permanent. Thank you.
Mazen, thank you very much for giving us a summary of the current dire humanitarian situation in Suwayda. I'm going to move to Sawsan. Sawsan, based on everything we've seen in Suwayda and earlier this year against the Alawite minority group, and as a person yourself who's heavily involved in the work of the Syrian civil society, how can trust be achieved between the new Syrian government on the one hand and Syrian minorities as well as other communities on the other, who are more concerned now about the country's transition? What are the key challenges moving forward and how should they be addressed? And if you allow me, please, I have a question, another question. Do you have any comments on what Qutaiba Idlbi said specifically with respect to the fact-finding commission? To you, Sawsan, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Noam. Thank you very much. I want to reiterate that I'm speaking today in my personal capacity, not in my capacity as a representative of Madaniya or any of the other initiatives that I lead or am involved in. And I would like to address and respond to your question from the perspective of what's taking place today in Suwayda, given that the situation is still dire, as Mazen explained, and the ceasefire is very fragile. Unfortunately, today, there's a broad consensus within Suwayda that the transitional government has been systematically involved in the atrocities and violent events that took place over the past 2 weeks. This is not only through the personnel of its defense and interior ministries who have directly committed war crimes as documented by themselves on phones and cameras, but the perception about this complicity is also through the policies and discourse of the state media, of the acts of the technical ministries, in the prevention of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to crucial international entities, particularly ICRC, in entering Suwayda to deal with the catastrophic humanitarian situation, and particularly the catastrophic situation of decomposing bodies who not only complicate the humanitarian situation, but further complicate future efforts for justice and accountability. And on top of that came the the rhetoric of the Reconciliation Committee that is supposedly established to maintain civil peace and social cohesion, and eventually with the president's own discourse that has been largely seen by people in Suwayda as igniting sectarian mobilization. So I'm saying this to reaffirm that the perception within the communities in Suwayda, regardless of the internal dynamics, is that there's an institutional complicity in the violations, but also the dire humanitarian situation. This is something that needs to be acknowledged if we are aiming to build trust and build confidence so that a solution could be talked about on the mid to long term. Unfortunately, as a result of this perception by local people inside Suwayda, there's a growing mobilization behind the rejection of the transitional government as part of any short-term solution to the current deadlock. And in response to your other comment on the report issued by the fact-finding committee for the coastal events, unfortunately, the press conference that was done by the committee on the coastal massacres did not help to ease the situation in Suwayda. It was not actually welcomed. It was met with deep skepticism, as it was not, in a way, it was seen to be downplaying the institutional nature of violence, framing it as isolated abuse rather than systematic policy. Now, the committee did provide excuses of why, of how the mandate and the time frame of its mandate has limited its ability to investigate further violations into a woman kidnapping and other aspects of, but this in itself resulted in intensifying the skepticism with efforts of the transitional government to actually lead independent investigations in the events of Suwayda. And I must explain here that the situation is very complex inside Suwayda. Activists and key players in the local communities and in the civic space have consistently rejected reducing the movement in Suwayda to religious representation. They emphasize that Suwayda's movement, both before and after the fall of the regime, is fundamentally civil and principled, calling for a democratic country, a unified democratic country founded on the basis of inclusive citizenship and human rights. However, the government's conflation of Hijri's position with that of national democratic voices has blurred the lines and delegitimized genuine civil demands into an inclusive political transition. The call for Israeli intervention by Hijri, of course, has further complicated the picture because it trapped those principled voices in the province who advocate for a unified democratic Syria rooted in rights and citizenship and not in foreign alignment or sectarian agendas. But those actors, those same national actors, including those who had previously sought dialogue channels with the Damascus government, has now shifted to firmly rejecting the government's role in any near-term solution as a result of the violence and the dire humanitarian situation that is unfolded over the past 2 weeks. Now, if we're talking about trust building in the short term, I think Suwayda presents an opportunity. To actually address the dire humanitarian situation, and B, to launch an independent investigation into the attacks and the violence and the atrocities that were committed, with transparent accountability for those complicits in the attacks on Suwayda. And I need to reiterate here that given that the local position is to reject the transitional government's role in this, then efforts must not be spared to allow international humanitarian aid, ICRC, UN agency, Syrian civil society, independent Syrian civil society agencies, but also independent independent fact-finding missions and human rights organizations who can actually present findings in a way that's acceptable to local communities above all. And then to start with accountability on an institutional level, taking into account the systematic nature of violations, starting from the coastal event and ending with Suwayda, is fundamental. These things need to start immediately because they're the only access to restore confidence building measures necessary for mid and long-term political solutions. And only when these things are addressed, we can move to speak about mid and long-term political solutions. And in here, I need to highlight the responsibility of the government, because seriously, the government has very big challenges that must be addressed immediately to put the country again back on track for a political, through a political process towards a peaceful future. Number one of this is the structure and performance of the army and the security forces. We cannot keep referring to the phenomenon of undisciplined individuals and groups. There is the systematic nature needs to be addressed on an institutional level, and this includes the issue of the foreign fighters, as was discussed earlier, but also the exclusionary religious indoctrination of the army and the security personnel, and the exclusion of qualified personnel, including from within defectors and from all the spectrum of the Syrian societies. Number two, amongst the big challenges that the transitional government faces today is the monopolization of power by the small trusted group of the president and his associates from the Salvation Government or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There is now a widespread rejection of partnership and marginalization of everyone in a clear violation to the constitutional declaration, which itself suffers huge gaps that needs to be reversed immediately. But even with the gaps, with the constitutional declaration, there is no rule of law. The constitutional declaration itself has been violated multiple times on the highest levels. This needs to be addressed. Rule of law is something essential to fix on the mid to long term if we're talking about a viable political solution. The other issue that's fundamental here is the attention of the transitional government on international demands and aspiration at the expense of local demands and consensuses. And unfortunately, this threatens further disconnection between different societies, and I'm not only talking about minorities that have been subjected to violations here, but wider societies inside Syria and the current authorities. And linked to this is the securitization of local governance. This is a serious issue, managing internal files strictly through a security lens and reliance solely on brutal force driven by the comfort and the international legitimacy that the transitional government has managed to secure is evolving into an authoritarian rule. And this needs to be immediately addressed by resorting to proper dialogue with local actors across the country to instate a decentralized governance model that takes into account needs and concerns within a unified Syria. And then eventually is the lack of transparency and accountability. And I'm again referring here to the incidents in the courts and more recently in Suwayda and whatever took place in between in Jaramana and Sahnaya and in the suicidal attack on the church in Dwel'a. The failure to demonstrate transparency and seriousness in holding violators accountable will lead to further erosion of public support and public trust. And unfortunately, it's not enough that the Ministry of Interior, issues news about arresting X and Y every now and then. There needs to be proper transparency about the chain of command and how these multiple events have came to unfold and what is actually being done to prevent this from happening on an institutional level, not just by arresting individuals without really being transparent about their relationship to what took place. Now, these issues must be addressed immediately and through a course correction that resets the political process, because and for that, so that we can look into solutions, a sustainable solution on the mid to long term. If these files are seriously addressed by the transitional government, we can talk about a genuine national conference, again, that brings together all parties and civil and political representation to the table to agree on a new social contract. This is not a luxury anymore, it's an urgent need. This dialogue will take months and probably years, but it will ensure that deep issues are raised and discussed and not simply overlooked for quick wins. This needs to be reflected in a reformed constitutional declaration and a strict enforcement of law. Not only the current constitutional declaration, as I said, has serious flaws, it has also been violated by the transitional authorities at top levels repeatedly. It needs to be this whole management of the situation needs to also be reflected in restructuring of the army, but also restructuring of the state institutions to remove the influence of the deep state, whether we're witnessing that through the phenomena of al-sheikh that comes in every level of state institution, or even more systematically with the establishment of the Directorate of Political Affairs, which is reproducing the Ba'ath Party structures and its entanglement with the state institutions. So I'm afraid that we're at a very slippery slope. However, there are confidence building measures that can be taken immediately to restore trust with the people of Suwayda and As-Sahel, and those who were subjected to other violations. There are serious files that the transitional government needs to address, and then eventually we can speak about resetting a political process that can genuinely ensure a sustained peace.
Sawsan, thank you so much for highlighting all these deep challenges. And to the audience who are watching us, Sawsan, as well as Mazen, they're from the region, they're Syrians, they've been following all these events for a very long time. And we very much appreciate your input, sharing with us those insights. I'm going to move to the second round of questions, and I would like to ask Andrew, Mazen, and Sawsan to please do your best to limit, if you can, the answers to just like few minutes, because we're running out of time, and I really want to take advantage of the time we still have. We have around like 25 minutes, and we still need to take Q&A. Mazen, in brief, some see that negotiations between the Druze community and the Syrian government are inevitable to avoid further violence, and that the Druze need to work closely with the state to address the recent bloodshed and mend ties. What's your take on that? And are there any other solutions that would ensure a better future for the Druze community in Syria? To you, Mazen. Thank you.
Thank you, Naum. Before any discussion of negotiations or future arrangements can take place, it is imperative, as Sawsan did, to clearly identify who bears responsibility for the current crisis. The transitional administration headed by interim President Ahmed Shara is not a neutral party, nor a legitimate mediator. It is the very actor that launched the initial military assault on Suwayda between July 13 and 16. That assault produced the highest number of civilian casualties, carried out mass executions, triggered widespread displacement, and deliberately targeted critical infrastructure and essential services. It is in its current form, the transitional administration has no legitimacy within the Druze community. It functions as a direct extension of Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, which has consolidated control over the emerging state apparatus and imposed an exclusionary ideological framework across every sector, including public services, religious institutions, and education. President al-Shara now governs under the so-called constitutional declaration that grants him unchecked powers. There is no meaningful separation of powers, no independent judiciary, and no system of accountability. Political and social actors not aligned with dominated Salafi current have been systematically marginalized, while advocates of democratic values and secularism have been silenced or driven out. What is emerging today in Damascus is not pluralistic political order. It is a theocratic authoritarian regime grounded in rigid religious orthodoxy and enforced by clerical authority embedded deep within the state structure. Even local administrative bodies operate under the guidance of ultra-conservative religious figures who dedicate what is permissible and what is prohibited. This model of governance is fundamentally incompatible with the values and aspiration of the Druze community and other minorities, and even the majority of Sunnis, which has long advocated for a democratic, secular Syria in which all citizens enjoy equal rights under the law. In this context, talk of reconciliation or constructive negotiations is disingenuous. The transitional administration doesn't seek political partnership. It seeks the complete submission of the Druze population. What is being offered are not the terms of political agreement, but the terms of surrender. This posture explains the repeated use of violence and the deployment of tribal militias as tools of collective punishment against Suwayda's civilian population. When considering solutions or what might be described as a plan B, as you mentioned, for the Druze community or for any group excluded by the hardline Salafi state project, now being imposed by the transitional administration, it is essential to adopt a broader political perspective. Suwayda is currently under siege and facing systematic destruction. Yet, from the perspective of Damascus, it holds little strategic value economically and geographically. It lies off international trade routes, lacks major natural resources, and has long endured drought, economic marginalization, and collapse of basic services, even during the Assad regime. Despite this, Suwayda has consistently voiced a distinct political position. Since August 2023, its people have staged daily protests demanding the fall of the Assad regime, the revival of meaningful politics, the implementation of international resolution for political transition in Syria. Their aspirations are clear: the establishment democratic state and guarantees freedom, equality, and pluralism. This vision, however, was extinguished with the collapse of the regime, only to be replaced by hardline Islamist authority that offers no space for Druze, Alawite, Christians, Kurds, and even moderate Sunni equal stakeholders in shaping Syria's future. This emerging authority has responded to dissent not by dialogue, but with accusations of hearsay and treason, backed by campaign of dehumanization that has paved the way for atrocities and forced displacement. Under such conditions, it is no surprise that minority communities refuse to join Halo government or participate in the political process they are rightly view as performative and coercive. And
we still have less than 1 minute, Mazen. Yeah, because we need. Yeah, please.
Okay. This leaves us with two viable paths forward. First, the launch of a new political process under credible international auspices, one that seeks to rebuild the Syrian national consensus based on genuine reconciliation, pluralistic governance, periodic and transparent elections, and constitutional framework that protects fundamental rights and liberties. Second, if such a process proves unachievable, there must be a serious reconsideration of governance structure in Syria through decentralized federal or confederal models that grants real autonomy to regions that reject authoritarianism and religious extremism. These models must guarantee the protection of minorities, preserve Syria's social and cultural diversity, and create space for genuine political engagement beyond the logic of the domination, coercive, and absolutism. And to finish, the alternative—
In brief, please, Mazen.
Yeah. Continued rule through the theocratic absolutism and sectarian exclusion is not only morally indefensible, but politically unsustainable. These are remnants of a sultanic past that have no place in future Syrians are struggling to build. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mazen. Sawsan, I'm going to move to you. A couple of questions. First, do you agree with what Mazen said? And do you have anything to add to what Mazen shared with us? And the other part of my question is, we look at Lebanon, we look at Iraq, right? Two countries that also had their own conflicts, and it took them a long time to recover. It took the communities in both countries a long time to heal from the traumas. Do you feel like Syria is being treated differently now? Do you feel like reconciliation, is being rushed? To you, Sawsan, any thoughts you can share with us would be very much appreciated.
Thanks, Noam. I know that some of Mazen's comments may be controversial today amongst Syrians, particularly speaking about international auspices of the political dialogue. But this is why precisely I insist on the need for a genuine dialogue inside Syria, so that there are better understanding amongst different communities and different civil and political actors of what can help this country and its different communities move forward. In terms of reconciliation, I do see that this is unfortunately a rushed process. It is not addressing deep grievances that communities inside Syria continue to hold. I'm talking about the victims of the Assad era, as well as the victims of the recent violations that took place during the rule of the current transitional government. We've seen in multiple occasions that there are national committees who have been established. Some brilliant Syrian professionals and human rights defenders have been integrated in these committees. But unfortunately, there has been a lot of discussion on civil peace in an enforced way that actually undermines prospects for justice. There has been systematic deprioritization of the demands of victims and families of the victims. And I'm again referring here to the victims of the Assad era, let alone victims of the recent months. But simultaneously, while deprioritizing the needs and priorities of these victims and their families, we have seen figures involved in past abuses being reintegrated under the banner of preserving civic peace, which undermines trust. This approach sends really worrying messages. It says that stability comes at the expense of justice and that accountability can be postponed indefinitely. And I think this is a red line for Syrians. The Civil Peace National Committee have failed to play a unifying role. We've seen how it contributed to igniting sectarian mobilization in the Suwayda events. But even going beyond that, I think that the mere structure of this Civil Peace National Committee reflects a lack of understanding to the complexities of the Syrian societies and the multi-layers divisions and grievances that that multiple Syrian societies live in and experience. And this is why we insist on independent, locally trusted fact-finding missions and human rights groups who can document realities, who can present narratives that prevent hate speech from filling in gaps and further politicization of violations and speculations, etc. Only truth can set a path for proper justice and accountability. Now, there's a lot that has been done for the Assad era. Great, we just need to act on that. There is lack of act on that, but there is a lot to be done for the atrocities that have been committed in the past few months under the rule of the transitional authorities, and this needs to be addressed immediately, so that the process to stabilize the country does not come at the expense of justice and accountability, and does not reproduce more cycles of violence in the future.
Right. Sawsan, thank you. Andrew, we listened to Mazen, we listened to Sawsan, and they shared with us the challenges Syria is facing right now. And they said that we cannot move forward and pretend like nothing is going on before addressing those deep divisions and, frankly, concerning developments. My question to you, is there a plan B for Syria? Like, when you look at the US policy, do you think there is a plan B, and should there be a plan B?
Yeah, so the plan B refers to US Syria envoy Tom Barak's statement about there is no plan B. And what I think that meant was that there was no plan B to a centralized government in Damascus that's able to unify the country. And the bet on the basis of the bet on which President Trump, laid forward on May 13th and has unwound ever since that time. So I think in that regard, Washington doesn't see a plan B in that sense. Now, what that means in terms of the behavior of the government in these circumstances, Barack's statements, I think, have been pretty clear about emphasizing inclusion, talking about holding people accountable. His tweets and statements have shifted in this regard. So while he continues to make the bet on Ahmed Ashara and the transitional government, which isn't a surprise, at the same time, I think they've changed a little bit in terms of the issues that they're focusing on. They are focusing on them in a behind the scenes, more friendly fashion, which is what the U.S. should do in this situation. And I think that they really do want to change the government's behavior and change the situation so that you can put the pieces of Syria back together again. Ultimately, the recipe for that has to come from a political process, a viable political process. And so far, we don't have that.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. And I'm going to ask you to take advantage of the time we still have. A question which I believe you can answer is, so the person here is saying that what Qutaiba, Mr. Qutaiba Idlbi said about Israel's intervention causing quote unquote more harm than good. The person who's asking this question disagrees with it and would like to hear your own assessment, Andrew, of Israel's intervention during the developments or the bloodshed in Suwayda. How would you assess it?
Sure. So I think in terms of what Qutaiba said in this regard, and I'd have to go back and check this, but I heard that he said that the violence intensified after Israeli action, but actually the violence had already broken out. So I think that's an important point. Like, Israel didn't bomb southern Syria in the middle of a peaceful situation, quite the contrary. And I think that that's borne out by the record. I think what he was referring to were the strikes in Damascus, both near the presidential palace and the Rais al-Arkan on Mawin Square, which is, I don't know. It's a bit like hitting something on Pennsylvania Avenue, I guess, in Washington, D.C. And so I think that there were a lot of questions about, was that useful to get the government to stop? Well, it was. I mean, ultimately, in the South, I think the strikes were not enough to get them to stop. Ultimately, that did get them to stop by hitting Damascus. But I think there's also, rightfully, a fear of a political blowback from that, where you're not just enforcing a red line with the government, but you could also be not serving the purposes of an overall settlement by making what was happening in the defense of a minority in the southern part of Syria into something that that the transitional government rallies everyone around the flag, around resistance to Israel. And I think this is an important thing to understand, because too many transitional processes in the Arab countries, particularly those that are bordering Israel, have been interrupted or arrested by blaming everything on the neighboring country. Yeah. Israel's actions in southern Syria, I make distinct from those that are in the broader sense in terms of hitting Damascus. And so I think that the administration has engaged with both Israel and Syria in this regard. I think we saw a joint statement between the U.S., France, and Syria, I believe. But missing was the Israelis, and which indicates to me that they have agreed but are holding their options open. And I think the options open concern their concerns about the Druze community, but also about southwestern Syria and challenges to their security across the Golan frontier.
Right. And you do believe those concerns are also driven by the fact that we did see, and correct me if I'm wrong, extremist elements in the south, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that we have extremist elements who are in southwest Syria, and they at the moment are focused on the Druze, unfortunately, right? And to a certain degree on each other. But at a certain point, could they be, I think this is what Israel's concern is, will they be focused on Israel? Will they be focused on attacking across the frontier as Hamas attacked across the frontier? Right. And this is part of what they talk about, the post-October 7th sort of trauma inside of Israel and the lessons learned. And I think this does drive Israeli thinking. They don't want to see that area become a hostile area to their interests. And dealing with this is going to be very tricky. I think also to point out that there is also the role of, there is a Druze community in Israel that was demanding action. And many showed up on the frontier to go in and fight. And it became very messy because it became a sectarian issue, because the central government in Damascus could not assert its authority and come up with a viable political settlement to this new Syria.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm going to take last question before we end our policy forum. The question is, what steps is the government taking to professionalize its army, namely removing those who commit atrocities and integrating citizens from a cross-section of Syria's communities into the army? I don't know, Mazen, would you like to take this question, or yeah? Or Sawsan, whoever feels
I will,
you can also briefly. Yeah,
I will mention something here. It's a systematic issue. It's not related to the those people, those fighters who didn't obey the orders from above. For example, just to say, two figures are central to this mobilization of the tribes. Hussein Salami, head of the emerging Syrian intelligence apparatus and the member of Aqidat tribe, and Ahmed Jassim, known as Abu Amsha from Naim tribe, and the senior commander in the Ministry of Defense. Both have deep ties to tribal structures and extremist factions, and both played a direct role in inciting Arab tribes from across Syria to intervene in Suwayda. This is not just a random issue. This is systematic. I will give Sawsan the speech.
I don't have much else to add on that, unfortunately, other than, I don't know what's actually taking place today, but I know that what needs to take place is more transparency and, as I said, addressing the institutional elements in how the current structure of the army and security forces is becoming complicit in such atrocities, and moving beyond the rhetoric of undisciplined groups and individual unconnected acts to try and see what is dysfunctioning systematically.
Okay, and Andrew?
There is a criticism of the government in terms of a double standard in terms of the integration of armed forces into the new Syrian army. On the one hand, we have units that have been integrated into the Syrian army with whole cloth, and so you have the units and you have their commanders, and they become part of this larger force.
Yeah.
When it comes to minority-dominated areas, they want people not to join as units, but as, quote, individuals. And this has been emphasized over and over again, particularly in the negotiations with the SDF in Northeast Syria. And so the question, I think many minorities are looking at, why are they being asked to join as individuals in an atomized group, while there are others who they can see used to fight against them in other units that now are whole units or divisions of the Syrian security forces or the army. I think that's a viable criticism. Now, running this all to ground is going to be hard because it's, again, ground dynamics. But these are the questions that Damascus needs to answer, and I think the United States needs to look at very closely, both from an intelligence as well as a policy standpoint.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And with that, we end our virtual policy forum. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and take care.